Welcome, everyone. Please be seated and turn off the cell phones and the tweets and the ticks and whatever else everybody does these days with their smartphones, etc. Thank you so much. Welcome to our panel on the Doniger Affair, censorship, self-censorship, and the role of the Academy in the public understanding of religion. Welcome so much. We're really grateful to have you all here. As our program says, in February 2014, Penguin India agreed to cease all publication of Wendy Doniger's The Hindus and Alternative History in connection with the settlement of a defamation lawsuit in India about the book. This alarming development raises major issues for the academic study of religion, censorship, self-censorship, the methodological challenges of authenticity and representation, and tensions between insider and outsider perspectives. The Doniger book controversy also reveals the very public and political implications of religious studies scholarship. There are many ways in which academic scholarship might be unduly circumscribed through dominant narratives that are not easily challenged in the academy and in the public square. I'd like to begin with just a few points to frame the conversation that we're going to have today. So some things you might want to know that may not have been clear from the public discourse that we, those of us interested in this topic, read on the internet and in other publications. Very important things to know. First of all, India's law against religious defamation passed in 1927 under the British Raj. And those of you who were at the panel discussion earlier this morning that was all about India and this law know the historical background, and I commend you to some of those papers. Next, the law applies to all religions, not only Hinduism. And it prohibits outraging the religious feelings of any religion, not just Hinduism. And I thought that wasn't clear in a lot of the media conversations, just by way of omission for the most part. And banned writings include the Satanic Verses, which were offensive to Muslims, the Da Vinci Code, offensive to Christians, and other offending writings for other religions as well, including tweets, jokes, translations of other works. So many nations have religious defamation laws, including 17 in the Asia Pacific, 15 in the Middle East, and it may come as a surprise to you, 36 in Europe, including Germany, France, and Belgium. But our conversation today is not about India. Our conversation today is about us and the kind of conversation we can have here at the American Academy that possibly they can't have in India, or maybe they can based on different conversations in a different frame. But what they do there is not our concern today for this panel. Our concern today is our academic debate. Because even though 44% of countries worldwide have laws against defamation of religion, according to the Pew Research Center Forum on Religion and Public Life, we here have the American Academy's mission statement. And I just want to remind everyone what it says. The Academy is dedicated to furthering knowledge of religion and religious institutions in all their forms and manifestations, in a context of free inquiry and critical examination. The Academy welcomes all disciplined reflection on religion, both from within and outside communities of belief and practice, and seeks to understand its broad public understanding. So what we want to address here is not the debate so much in India, but whether we can have an open conversation that leads to better understanding, and understand perhaps what is at stake and for whom when a lauded scholar of Hinduism extends understanding of what is included in the word Hinduism. Are some viewpoints in effect banned from particular in-group discussions here at the Academy because extremists on the other side of the globe have taken politically unpalatable stances there? Or because scholarship that does not fit in a particular group's self-understanding offend them? Are there some viewpoints that are in effect banned when scholars opt out of the conversation altogether because we can't have a civil debate? And I worry about this particularly for new scholars. When they see a discordant debate, say, wait, maybe I better not weigh in on that, when maybe that new perspective is exactly what we need. So today, our distinguished non-practitioner and practitioner scholars have come together to enrich the conversation, not only for the sake of good scholarship on Hinduism, but also as an exemplar for the public of understanding of religion generally. I'd like to begin by introducing our first panelist, Wendy Doniger, our distinguished panel, by the way. I am so grateful to have all three of you here. Wendy Doniger graduated from Radcliffe College and received her PhD from Harvard University and her Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University. She has been called the most powerful person in academic Hinduism studies today. She is a former president of the American Academy of Religion and of the Association of Asian Studies. She now leads religious studies at the University of Chicago, chairs many academic and other important bodies, has 2 PhDs actually from Harvard and Oxford, and is a prolific author of 40 books, including the book that we are talking about today. Can we have that conversation of critical encounter and mutual respect that we have come to expect in the Academy? I think so with this distinguished panel, and would like to begin by welcoming Professor Doniger to our conversation. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to shed some light on this murky subject. And my argument really will be that we are connected to things in India, and that the problems in India are both the cause of, and in some cases the result of, things that are going on in America today. So I don't think we can separate them out quite so neatly. I want to begin by saying that the problem we're discussing is really not the Doniger affair at all. It's not about me. I actually haven't had an affair in over 15 years. It's, it's a problem that has confronted many other scholars, both India-born scholars, A.K. Ramanujan, Romila Thapar, and American-born scholars, Paula Richmond, Paul Courtright, and that really threatens all scholars of Hinduism. It's not a respecter of national boundaries. As for the part of the problem that involved me, since it comes from both Dinanath Batra in India and Rajiv Malhotra in America, I would call it the Malbatra affair. Barbara mentioned that I'm the most powerful person in academic studies in Hinduism today. That was part of a notorious article that Rajiv Malhotra wrote about me that I'll refer to later on. And I've always used it as part of my CV under honors and testimonials that he said, and it was picked up, and it's useful for things like introductions. So in 2009, Penguin Books in New York published the book The Hindus, and in 2010, Penguin India published it in India. And within months, a man named Dinanath Batra, a then 81-year-old school headmaster and member of the RSS, brought the first of a series of civil and criminal actions, that's an important point, both, against me, Penguin Group USA, and Penguin Books India, arguing that my book violated the notorious Article 94A of the Indian Penal Code, about which there was a wonderful panel this morning. You should get a hold of those papers. A code which forbids deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings of any class. Penguin India drafted its lawyers to defend the suit, but after 4 years, and most significantly after Bertelsmann and Pearson bought Penguin India and changed the rules and said basically, drop the lawsuit, then, only then, on February 10th, 2014, they abandoned the case and agreed to stop publishing the book. This led to 2 widespread misunderstandings. First of all, Penguin also agreed to pulp all remaining copies, but as it turned out, not a single book was destroyed. All extant copies were quickly bought up by the bookstores. And second, the book was never banned, for it never reached the courts of any Indian government. There was just a lawsuit and an out-of-court agreement between 2 private parties, the Batra Brigade and the publishers. But the words banned and pulped continued to be used to fan the flames of media indignation. Indeed, Batra never succeeded in harming me in any way. The announcement that the giant penguin had crumbled under the assault of a fanatical, semi-literate old man set off an extraordinary wave of angry publicity directed against Penguin. If Batra's aim was to stop people from reading my books, his plan has certainly backfired. The Batra publicity catapulted the Hindus to sales I had never dreamt of. It was number 9 on Amazon for a while, a writer's equivalent of a knighthood or canonization. In addition to rocketing international sales, the Hindus is also still available in India, in pirated PDFs, in copies held in the back rooms of Indian bookstores and sold in brown paper wrappers, and openly for sale in the Delhi airport and in the big bookstores of the Khan market. This is in the form of copies of the New York edition, imported by some enterprising Indian merchant. Penguin, as of last week also, has agreed to let the rights revert to me, and the book will be republished in India, probably by the man who was the head of Penguin India when the book was first published, and who quit when Bertelsmann took over, the great Ravi Singh, who was willing to fight it through the courts if necessary. So no harm was done to me. But Batra's activities in India have done great harm to freedom of speech there and great potential harm to the study of religion in the United States. This is why I think they're joined at the hip, these 2 problems. In India, Orient Black Swan nervously decided to have several of its books about which Batra had not raised any objection at all, vetted in a sort of preemptive move that some might call self-censorship. Batra had merely sent a legal notice on another book saying that it defamed the RSS. We talked this morning about offending religious groups, but also offending political groups in India. In what one journalist construed as panic and a dangerous precedent, Orient Black Swan said that it was undertaking a pre-release assessment of books that might attract similar reactions, end quote. And Batra has done more serious damage by censoring school textbooks. In India, both in 1999, when the BJP came to power, and now again. Narendra Modi endorsed Batra's books when he was Gujarat Chief Minister and set him to altering textbooks again as soon as he became Prime Minister. Batra's revisions included the claim that the Taj Mahal, the Qutub Minar, and the Red Fort, 3 of India's outstanding examples of Islamic architecture, were designed and commissioned by Hindus. And that ancient India had the nuclear bomb and even practiced non-proliferation by carefully restricting the number of people who had access to it, presumably to Brahmins. The revisionists also demanded that several prominent historians should be arrested. In 2005, America saw similar Hindu attempts to censor textbooks, taking out references to beef eating, pushing back the dates of major millstones in Indian history. It's interesting to slip, milestones in Indian history, and erasing or minimizing features of Hinduism that could be perceived as negative, such as the caste system, the social category of Dalits or untouchables, and the status of women. It's important to note that many Hindu Americans, as well as non-Hindu scholars, testified against the proposed changes. The range of opinions among Hindus in the American diaspora is as diverse as it is among Hindus in India. And indeed, most of the changes in the textbooks were never made, but some observers warned that the conflict could still have a negative impact on future textbooks if publishers, fearing similar protests, which are costly in the legal courts, were tempted to soften the context on their own initiative, the same sort of self-censoring that we see going on in India. America does not merely respond to repressive censorship in India. Sometimes repressive action flows from the United States diaspora back to India in a kind of pizza effect. Batra has said in an interview that Hindus who had protested in 2010 when my book, The Hindus, was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award in New York, these people got in touch with him to campaign to stop the book in India. Only then did he read the book and feel, quote, instantly angry, unquote. Similarly, at a presentation I made at a meeting of the American Academy of Religion in 2000 in Nashville, Tennessee, a wealthy New Jersey businessman named Rajiv Malhotra asked me a series of rather strangely worded questions about psychoanalysis. In a public lecture I gave in London in November 2003, exactly 3 years later, a woman who questioned me read from a paper the exact same words that Malhotra had used in the year 2000 in the United States. Nowadays, the internet greatly facilitates the spread of this sort of Malhotra traditional hatred. What is it that makes Malhotra so mad at me? For one thing, they want the world to see only the philosophical strand of Hinduism that the British endorsed and the so-called Hindu reform in the 19th century singled out as the right sort of Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, while I celebrate precisely the other strand of Hinduism, the one that the British scorned and taught the Sanatana Dharma faction to be ashamed of, a more vivid, often humorous, sometimes erotic Hinduism. But another factor is the fact that a non-Hindu is teaching and writing about Hinduism, a woman indeed, whose voice is presumed to drown out male Hindu voices. Malhotra protests against, quote, the protocols that authorize some and in their view disenfranchise other voices, especially through peer review, which he objects to strenuously. He opposes what he regards as a cartel of people committed to the global dominance of the Western knowledge factory, a cartel of which I am apparently a charter member. Another objection is to anyone writing about Hinduism from an academic rather than a confessional point of view. Hindus of the Malhotra faction demand that academic voices, even or especially from Hindus who happen to be academics or academics who happen to be Hindus, whom he regards as sepoy intellectuals, that is, Indians who betray their heritage by including Western disciplines such as religious studies. He demands that these voices should not be heard, and that is where the chauvinism slips in. We need to make a nuanced argument on whether the outraged religious feelings in question constitute a lying insult against a religion or a group of religious people, which could lead to violent disorder. This was the subject of this morning's panel, making it the equivalent of slander against an individual, or whether the hurt constitutes a reasoned argument or artistic venture intended to uncover the meaning of or contradictions within a particular identity of a person or group. Almost done. The territory of Indian Penal Code 295A is a treacherous no man's land in which to maneuver. To prove that one had or did not have deliberate and malicious intention of outraging religious feeling is a slippery matter. But there's a lot that we can do about this, both in India and in the United States. As I've said, several brave publishers have kept the Hindus alive in India, and when Batra attacked another book of mine on Hinduism, which had been published by a small Indian firm, the Olaf Book Company, that Ravi Singh started when he left Penguin when Bertelsmann took over. The publisher stood their ground, and On Hinduism is freely available in Indian bookstores, though Batra still claims to have stopped it. On another front, a consortium of publishers is preparing action to change the law under which books such as mine were attacked, to change it from a criminal to a civil suit, so that publishers convicted under that law would simply pay a fine instead of serving 3 years prison time. This would greatly reduce the hesitation to publish controversial books. In America, too, there is a need to speak out. Scholars, especially, Barbara referred to this, scholars, especially young, untenured scholars, fearing that if they studied sensitive topics such as caste or erotic temple art, they would be denied Indian visas, as has happened to several scholars in the UK recently, may self-censor their projects. It's therefore the particular responsibility of scholars with tenure, an increasingly rare luxury nowadays, to write about significant topics that might outrage religious feelings in India. In conclusion, what I'm doing myself to keep the full range of Hinduism in print, as it were, is I've recently published an anthology of Hinduism in the Norton Anthology of World Religions, in which I've tried to balance the canonical text well known to many Hindus and favored by the Hindu right, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Jack Hawley's wonderful translations of Bhakti poetry, to balance those with texts from the kind of Hinduism that the Hindu right would like to see disappear. A lot of Tukaram and Kabir in Linda Hess's wonderful translation, a tribal version of the Ramayana, and P.N. Oak's argument that the Taj Mahal is a Hindu palace, and a lot of contemporary poems by Dalits. This anthology will be distributed in India as well as in the United States. Batra cannot speak for all Hindus, and the study of Hinduism remains a gloriously rich mix which scholars, both Hindu and non-Hindu, must work to keep alive in all of its fullness in the public mind and in the academy. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Anant Rambachan, and he is professor of religion at St. Olaf College, Minnesota, USA. His books include Accomplishing the Accomplished, The Vedas as a Source of Valid Knowledge, The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's Reinterpretation of the Authority of the Vedas, The Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity, and most recently, A Hindu Theology of Liberation. Not two is not one. Please welcome Professor Rambachan to the stage.
Thank you very much, Barbara, friends. The AAR publicized this as a blockbuster panel. I think for me it's more a crossfire panel because I know I stand between two parties. At the end of this panel, I will be accused by some of not throwing an egg at Professor Doniger. And at the end of this, okay. And at the end of this panel, I will be accused by others of not speaking eloquently enough for academic freedom. And I'm very much aware of being in the middle of those two contending groups. The controversy surrounding Professor Doniger's book has been framed largely as one of censorship versus free inquiry. And although this is a very important dimension of the discussion, limiting the issue to this dichotomy does not help us to get to some of the deeper concerns, implicit and explicit. Among these are issues of insider and outsider scholarship and discourse, as well as methodologies for the study of religion. As far as the latter is concerned, I have in mind particularly the normative and descriptive ways of studying religion. On the one hand, there is the issue of freedom and censorship, where the concerns are framed almost entirely by the ideals of political liberalism. the issues of insider-outsider scholarship and methodologies of inquiry highlight a different set of concerns. The specific matter centered on Penguin's withdrawal of Professor Doniger's book will subside, undoubtedly, but some of the larger issues will persist. And as scholars of religion practiced in the art of exploring subjects in their multi-dimensionality, we need to identify and consider some of these issues. Let me begin with an observation that I see as positive. Although they may not constitute the primary audience for our writing, and though we may give little thought about how they receive our work, practitioners of Hindu traditions are paying attention to our work. If being ignored is the living death for a scholar, I want to say that this growing attention is good for our academy. We may not always welcome some of their responses that they offer to our scholarship, but their interest certainly underlines the broader significance of our work. Scholarship informed by colonial assumptions was not primarily addressed to Hindu practitioners and had little concern about what practitioners thought. The growing interest in our work is symptomatic of an awakening, a stirring in the Hindu community, reflecting its emergence from colonialism and a growing concern with the ways in which the tradition is studied and represented in our academy. The Hindu tradition is a living one. And Hindus certainly have a right to study and interrogate us, and our responses to such scrutiny ought not to be arrogant and disdainful. It is unfortunate that derisive name-calling has been a part of the rhetoric on both sides of this issue. Let me add a personal note to my contribution to set what I want to say in some context. I understand what it means to have one's scholarship caricatured and misrepresented, and to be callously denounced with crude labels, and I am an insider. I have been described as belonging to a school that is basically undermining Hinduism, as being nurtured by the Catholic Church as a useful Hindu, as obediently copying Western scholarship, a hater of Swami Vivekananda, and even an intellectual terrorist. And these are not among the worst that I can tell you about. As a scholar practitioner whose world of meaning is shaped decisively by the theological insights of my tradition, I write intentionally for my community and the academy. My commitment to my tradition does not allow me to cede power to those who condemn me to define its meaning. I must be faithful to the truth of my scholarship and my responsibility to pursue truth as I see it. This often requires me to be self-critical and to challenge interpretations that I regard as justifying inequality and injustice. I do so, however, as a committed insider, as an engaged lover of my tradition, intent on being constructive. When I critically engage my co-religionists and my tradition, I do so with reverence and with respect. This is not only because of my value for its deep and transformative wisdom and disciplines, and its existential meaning for my co-religionists, but because I know and I recognize the bruised and the battered Hindu self. Religious traditions that have emerged from the colonial experience have done so with diminished self-worth and self-value. They are concerned in a special way with respect and with restoring value for self. They are suspicious of the motives of Western scholarship. They have learned much about the authority of the Western world in defining their identity, and they continue to worry about power imbalance. The question is not only who speaks for Hinduism, but also whose voices are heard. Even as we must support and speak for academic freedom, let us recognize the frustration of those who may feel powerless in having their voices heard. Professor Doniger's voice in the academy and in the public square is certainly heard more powerfully than any Hindu voices. This is a paradoxical reality, since so much of our work is concerned with giving space and voice to those Hindu communities who are marginalized and who are silent. Although there are many Hindu scholar practitioners teaching in the academy, the overwhelming number for various historical and other reasons are not. The majority of those who research, teach, and speak about the tradition in the academy are not Hindus. Hindus are appreciative of interest in their tradition, but there are concerns about the consequences of this reality of imbalance for the tradition. Scholarly work in the academy, despite what many may claim, is never merely descriptive. And I want to interrogate this point with some concern. It is never merely, never only teaching about a religion. The predominant kinds of research that is done and the methodologies employed also define a tradition. Therefore, although I understand and appreciate the well-known distinction between teaching religion and teaching about religion, I am not sure that the line of separation is as sharp as some in the academy might represent it to be. I think that there is a defining process, and even an advocacy at work in the religious studies method that needs to be acknowledged. As a Hindu scholar, for example, I teach about my tradition in the sense of trying to help my students understand its meaning in my writings, and when questions arise in the classroom, I do advocate for certain interpretations for marginalized communities. This dual role I am suggesting is not limited to Hindu scholars who are practitioners, but it is true also of those who may regard themselves as outsiders. Both insiders and outsiders are engaged in different ways in work that has normative implications for the Hindu tradition. I must therefore disagree with Professor Doniger's view that there is a concerted effort by Hindus, and I am quoting, to limit the academic study of and teaching of Hinduism to people who are themselves Hindus, end of quote. I do not perceive a pervasive claim on the part of Hindus that only Hindus should study and teach about Hinduism. There is certainly a strong desire for scholarship that exemplifies respect for the object of its study. This is not unique to Hindus, and it is not a desire that is very difficult to understand, coming from people belonging to a living tradition and whose sense of self is invested in that tradition. I recognize that defining respect is difficult and problematic, and even more so when the scholar is an outsider. I will not advocate for any definition of respect that excludes disagreement or which supports censorship with the argument that the scholar's work is offensive to a particular community. If a religious community asks for scholarly respect, then I think it is also incumbent on that community to clarify its understanding of respect in a manner that is consistent with the freedom and responsibility of scholars to pursue truth. Definitions of respect must also be such that they may be reasonably demonstrated, especially by an outsider. An unattainable definition of respect, or one that is attainable by some and not others, does not help us in this regard. I wrote this paragraph before reading Professor Doniger's review of Richard Davis's book, The Bhagavad Gita, a biography, in which she criticizes him, and I'm quoting, for being more than adequately respectful and for leaning over backward to avoid offending Hindus. And so Barbara's asked us to maybe raise some questions. So this is one of my questions. I think it would be very helpful to have Professor Doniger elaborate on what constitutes adequate respect. If Davis is more than adequately respectful, what in a scholar constitutes adequate respect for a tradition? Being an outsider does not, in my view, disqualify a scholar from normative analysis and judgments. I think, however, that it is important that outsiders acknowledge this dimension of their work and do not represent their scholarship as only descriptive. Thank you. Engaging a tradition normatively, however, involves a different set of assumptions about that tradition, and the appeals to political liberal ideas may not be sufficient. Interestingly, Mahatma Gandhi was open to the normative judgment of the outsider, but specified also the commitments that are necessary. These include reverence for what is worthy in the tradition and friendship with the religious other. The issue is not limited to one of free speech. Gandhi's commitments suggest that the right to speak about a community is different from the right to be heard by that community. The latter requires a different set of obligations. Traditionally, the insider doing normative work, like the work that I do, had commitments to some interpretations of the tradition. And in my work, I identify those normative places from which I speak. It is helpful for the outsider engage in normative work, as I am saying a lot of the religious studies scholars are doing. It is helpful to identify the commitments that inform that work, to be open about those normative commitments, especially when they are not derived from the tradition that is being studied. Where are your normative places? Where are your normative, where are the normative grounds that you stand? Okay, I'm going to skip some of it because I'm out of time, but let me conclude with a comment on Batra. Okay, that's my final point. Professor Doniger and others have noted the underlying tensions of this controversy between two different ways of speaking about religion. And Professor Doniger characterizes these approaches as the pious and the academic. And she has also called attention to the absence of the discipline of religious studies, or its equivalent in India. And she wrote that students in India can study religion as a Hindu or Muslim or Catholic in private theological schools of one sort or another, but not as an academic subject in the university. And I think that this dichotomy obscures the complexity of both ways of studying religion, since it often implies that the pious is naive, irrational, uncritical, while the academic is where you have true objectivity, reasoning, and critical inquiry. We know very well that the pious is compatible with rigorous inquiry, while the academic is not free from its own kinds of bias. And I think that is a mischaracterization to say that in India, only the pious method of studying religion obtains. India has a very long tradition of critical inquiry about religion. So I think on the whole, we need always, on all sides, to acknowledge methodological diversity. And in addition to acknowledging it, to be humbly cognizant of the underlying assumptions and limits of some of our methods of study. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
And now our final panelist, another very distinguished scholar. Vasudha Narayanan is Distinguished Professor, Department of Religion at the University of Florida, and also past president of the American Academy of Religion. She was educated at the universities of Madras and Bombay in India and at Harvard University. She is the author or editor of 7 books and numerous articles, chapters in books, and encyclopedia entries, and she is the associate editor of the 6-volume Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism. Please welcome Professor Narayanan to the podium.
Namaste and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'd like to begin with a story from a 13th century biography called Guru Parampara Prabhavam. If it's a panel to do with anything to do with Wendy, it has to have a story. The splendor of the succession of teachers. Nampillai, in the 13th century, was giving a set of lectures on Nammarvar's 9th century poem, the Thiruvaimozhi. Apparently, he had asked his disciple Periyavachan Pillai to record his commentary, which he did. Meanwhile, another disciple, Vadakku Thiruveedi Pillai, unbeknownst to the teacher, wrote it down in greater detail and presented it to his teacher at the end. Incensed that the student had recorded this without permission, Nampillai ordered the manuscript to be cast away. Only one official version was to survive. Some time later, however it goes, Lord Vishnu appeared to Nampillai in his dream, told him he was wrong, the teacher was wrong, ordered that the manuscript should see the light of day, and asked for it to be released. The story has many themes, including the authority that society and the disciples assign to a teacher to control the flow of information, who has the authority to teach, to learn, and to be taught, who has the authority to write, and the close guard over what is transmitted, to whom it's transmitted, how they transmit it to others, above all, what is written. Perceptions and sometimes control of who has the qualifications to learn, like our own university admissions, were very strong. However, as we all recognize, the situation then was very different in that, unlike our internet and our media today, this was the only way to learn from a teacher in those days. The story also makes a point that the manuscript represents learning and should be out there in the open, in addition to officially commissioned ones and official versions. Paper, being a signifier of learning, is so dominant in Hindu cultures even now, and so prevalent that it can be even used in humor. In a website called 10 Ways to Blank Off an Indian, we have on top of the list praising the Pakistani cricket team during an Indian cricket match. And the second one is stepping on paper. Stepping on paper is to show disrespect to it. For many of us, when we see people stamp their feet on paper, it's like hearing chalk grate on a board. And so the idea of a book being pulped is anathema, an insult to learning. But the word insult has been used in many contexts in this controversy. Pulping a book is an insult to all learning, according to Hindus. But some Hindu writers have written that Dr. Doniger's book is insulting to Hindus. However, a whole swath of middle-of-the-road Hindus support, and I quote here, Professor Doniger's right to be published, even as they're maintaining the stand that they have a right to debate that which she publishes. End quote. And here we are in one of those professional debates. But before we begin to have a laundry list of the ideas that can be debated, let's start with a few things which I find most relevant here. We all know that Professor Doniger is a very prolific writer, a recovering Orientalist, as she calls herself, and one who works with texts. We have learned from her translations from the Vedas, her skillful editing of the critical study of sacred texts, the origins of evil in Hindu thought, and so on. Devadatta Patnaik, arguably one of the most popular writers on Hindu mythology in India, writes, "I've been referring to Wendy's books forever. I get access to stories and ideas I don't get access to easily otherwise. I find new ways of interpreting these stories. I see new points of view, new patterns. I see ideas that excite me. Do I agree with all of them? Of course not. Not everything, but that's what books are for." Two of the points that she makes in the first chapter in this book are worth repeating. The title of the first chapter says it all, The Man or the Rabbit in the Moon. We can see both. Our vision can be multifocal. Second, Dr. Doniger argues for and I quote, the simultaneous presence of a number of pairs of opposites, end quote. Most of us know that what we hear about in Hinduism is usually the ascetic temper and the renunciant's role. But a lot has happened, of course, in the scholarship in the last 20 years. We've been hearing a lot more of other things. But Dr. Doniger wants to showcase other elements in the Hindu tradition, the life-promoting joy, to balance sadhus and saints with Khajuraho and the Kama Sutra. This is not cause for debate, but we have to keep these perspectives in mind and to know there are many insights, many learning moments in Dr. Doniger's many, many works. But we are here today to discuss the issues that concern us as American Hindus. And here's a short list of those issues which people want to see debated. The book misrepresents Hinduism. It has factual errors, outdated information, perpetuates racist and Oriental stereotypes, and I'm reading here from a particular essay, and is academic pornography. Apart from this, some say she has no insider knowledge. This last point has already been discussed briefly by Professor Rambachan, and I'd like to set this aside, the fact that she's not a Hindu. This is the question of authority that we referred to earlier. Do you have the authority to write about this? Even the most sympathetic reviews of the book actually make this point. Ananya Vajpayee writes, "One problem is perhaps insurmountable. Her perspective remains that of an outsider, a knowledgeable, even expert outsider, but an outsider nevertheless. She seems to feel sympathy for the subject, but not empathy," close quote. Professor Juluri says, "Now consider a book called The Hindus. It's written by someone, it's written not by someone who grew up as a Hindu in a Hindu household, or presumably anything like living in a Hindu cultural environment," close quote. Well, of course, you're well aware of it. She says that and I quote Professor Doniger here, she says, "In our scholarly approach, we have to consider the history of Hinduism first from a Hindu viewpoint, then from an academic one. To change the metaphor and apply it to more specifically to Hindu texts, the story is a flame that burns no less brightly if strangers light their candles from it," close quote. Many other Hindus agree with this viewpoint, so I'd like to make the point that Hindus are not united in this kind of thing. It has to be nuanced much more. Aditi Banerjee, despite giving a scathing review of Professor Doniger's book, says, "The issue is not that she's an outsider," and then she goes on to cite other names of people, other scholars, Euro-American scholars, whom she holds in esteem. "In a global marketplace, this is a non-issue from certain perspectives," and that's the key word. We can and do study our and other traditions. However, who gets to articulate alternative histories, that may be of consequence, and that's where people kind of have a word. If the interpretation is something that, and this is a question I'd like to raise, if the interpretation is something that the practitioner does not like or believes is far-fetched, do they have the cultural property rights to nix the findings of the scholar? Other issues, people have raised the question of factual errors, which come up in critiques. This is a basket of specific issues, and each one has to be studied in its own merit. Factual errors such as dates, dynasties, maps, capital cities can be corrected, but books are not pulped for that reason. There's a slippery slope, however, between literary license, speculation, and being way out in left field, especially if it's left as in tantric left field. Ultimately, it's the predominant emphasis on things sexual that many Hindus object to in Professor Doniger's work. What are the other issues that the Hindu diaspora objects to? That she let off Islam and Muslims easy and is charitable about Muslim rule in India. Is India not given the credit that she produced? And instead, the credit is assigned to Muslims and to Europeans? Yes, this is only one of many books. And this is, to use your own language, it's not the only poker game in town. And Professor Doniger writes, this is a history, not the history of the Hindus. But is this book valorized because of the author? People seem to think she's powerful, her voice is heard. I would argue with that. With due respect, it's not that you're not the most powerful, but it's diluted. Her voice is diluted. It's muted because of Wikipedia. And the fact that we have so many different ways of knowing these days that this becomes only one of many viewpoints. I just had 2 paragraphs. The proclivity to celebrate the sexual aspect of the tradition and the sense that Dr. Doniger's work may get more visibility because of the author's status are the 2 main themes that run through this controversy. Whether we want to trace the non-sexual genes to our Brahminical ancestors or to our Victorian masters, it's still strong in many Hindu traditions, and the emphasis on sex, coupled with the perception that sexual interpretation is simply unwarranted, has been a major diaspora criticism. Should karma sorry, what am I saying? Should karma always be translated as sex? And after all, when Barbara Stoller Miller translated dharma as duty completely in the Bhagavad Gita, nobody gave her any flack. But when karma is translated that way, it becomes an issue. And what about us who are both Hindus and scholars? Trishanku was a righteous man who wanted to go to heaven in his mortal body. Mortal wanted to go to heaven in his body. A sage helped him in this enterprise. The celestial beings put a cease and desist order to this. Target of two different forces, one pushing him up, one pushing him down. Trishanku was stuck midair until Vishwamitra created a parallel heaven for him. But that is a heaven of isolation. For many of us here, all of us here in the audience, unlike the Devas and Trishanku, we occupy multiple worlds simultaneously. And when one is not right, we're here to debate, fix it, learn, and move on. Thank you.
All our scholars. Yes, that's on. We're going to turn now to a conversation among our panelists, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. And so a couple of you raised questions already, but I'd like to start with Professor Doniger, if you have some comments or questions. Sure.
Well, these are interesting points that both of my colleagues have raised. And I think some clarification is one of the problems about writing a lot is that you say things in one place and people quote you saying something else in another place. I certainly never meant to imply that I felt that the academic voice was better or should be the only voice to write about Hinduism. And I've said in a lot of places that I feel that there is not only room for that there is a necessity to have both voices present in the study of Hinduism, but that my ideal idea of a scholar is precisely the sort of a person that my two colleagues are, and I guess my ideal of all ideals was A.K. Ramanujan, namely someone who is both at home in the tradition and therefore knows things that I could not possibly know about Hinduism, and is at home in my tradition and knows how to play the rules of the academic game. So that's my ideal scholar, someone that I can't catch up with ever having been born in New York. At the same time, I think there's also a place for scholars who are only speaking from the Hindu tradition. There are the people who give the rest of us the material to work with, and those are the voices that we have to speak about. I object to the idea that someone who is not a Hindu should not teach about Hinduism. I object to the idea that the things I say are not acceptable simply because I'm not a Hindu, rather than they're unacceptable because I'm wrong about some things. So that's the point of the argument. Never anywhere have I ever said that I thought that the academy is a better fix on Hinduism than Hindus have. I think that it is an academic fix which is essential to the study of Hinduism in the academy. I distinguish religious studies, for instance, from interreligious dialogue, where I speak as a Jew and Vasu speaks as a Hindu. That's also something really worth doing, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the academic study of religion, by which, for instance, there are ways of dating texts, which what I would call a pious person, which is not an uncritical person, but there are versions of when the Mahabharata was composed and so forth, which are not validated by academic methods and therefore have a different status as truth statements from a statement that we have evidence that the language is such and such. So that's the first clarification. So the objection is not that there should be no I object to the objection that as a non-Hindu I don't have a right to speak. That does not mean that I think that non-Hindus are better at writing about Hinduism than Hindus are. So that should certainly be clarified. So as Anant pointed out, he's going to get it from both sides because you are one of Malbatra's sepoy intellectuals, right? You're someone who does, and Vasu also has had a lot of trouble in some quarters from being someone who plays both games. I only play one game. I can only play the game of someone trained in the academic study of religion. In answer to Anant's question about my objection to Richard Davis and the more than adequate respect and leaning over backwards, the objection came from a particular thing. Richard Davis wrote a wonderful book about the Gita, which I reviewed recently in the New York Review of Books, and I said it was a wonderful book about the Gita, and it is. It's about the history of the Gita and its reception. Nowhere in the book, anywhere, 280 pages, does he mention caste. Now, his own study of the Gita, as he shows it, shows that caste has been an issue, although he calls it class. And I object to that because class is a mild thing. We have it too, the French three estates and so forth. The refusal to use the word caste, I think, is a major distortion of the history of the Gita, and that's the only flaw in the book. Otherwise, it's fine. Why do he do something which is obviously academically sloppy? It's not sloppy. He's leaning over backwards, and I object to that. Caste is a real issue for Hindus in America in particular, and so that's what I meant about more than adequate respect. Adequate respect is not to say bad things about a religion, to go out of your way to avoid saying something that is true. It is true that caste is important in the history of Gita, and Richard Davis knows that it's true. To avoid saying that is, I think, over more than adequate respect. And finally, the word pious. I don't believe that the word pious means naive or uncritical or biased or any of those things. I simply mean that it accepts a certain view of the tradition, which is the native tradition. I could have said insider, although it's an awkward word. I think it's a different approach to texts from the approach of someone who's not a member of the tradition. But as I said, in my ideal scholar is someone who is born, my ideal scholar of Hindu is someone who's born and raised in the Hindu tradition, but who has also studied in the academy and writes according to the rules of the academy, rules about dating and authorship and so forth. So I wanted to clarify those things. Otherwise, I really agreed with everything that Anant said, and very eloquently too. I agreed with also most of what Vasu said. The Wikipedia problem, in a way that it dilutes everybody's voice, I would extend that to the internet in general. That there are just so many constructions of Hinduism out there, and in particular the constructions that are now coming from Narendra Modi himself in headline after headline, that the fact that Ganesha had an elephant's head put on his body proves that they had plastic surgery in ancient India. That's all over the internet, and the fact that Karna was born outside the womb shows that they had the fact that Gandhari divided the fetus into 101 parts and they all survived showed that they had genetic surgery and so forth in ancient India. The internet has a lot of pretty crazy stuff on it, and Wikipedia has some pretty crazy stuff on it as well. So the question then is not whether there are flaws in my book, The Hindus. My goodness, there are flaws. There are some that other people don't even know about than I know about. I have a list of dates in particular that I got wrong. The book was never edited at Penguin. That was the problem. I need a really strong editorial hand, and I have one. And when I published with Oxford, Cynthia Reed doesn't let me get away with anything. Penguin simply printed what I gave them, and so I'm there with all my flaws. I mean, there are many flaws in the book. There's no question about that. But it is not a book written in order to offend Hindus. It is not a book which actually over-sexualizes Hinduism. If you count the pages of the 700 that deal with sex, there are very few of them, but there are some. And I will defend my right to publish a book that does have mistakes in it. Most books do, and most 700-page books usually do. That's why errata lists were invented by God and an addenda and so forth. But a book with errors has a right to be published, and it should not be pulped or banned, and I'm glad that the Hindus was neither pulped nor banned. So that's my response to my two interlocutors.
So I'd like to turn to responses from either of you. Who would like to go first?
Wendy, you already mentioned, you answered this in part already. If you had to do this book again, all over again, how would you do anything differently at all? And in what way is this book different from your earlier works, such that it's got so much of attention?
Those are good questions. If I had to do it all over again, I would do it with Oxford instead of Penguin. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say was I would be more aware of my audience. And here I plead guilty to a kind of Orientalist bias. I've been a translator all my life, not just like I put this Rig Veda from Sanskrit into English and Laws of Madhu and the Kama Sutra, but that I've spent most of my long academic career introducing India to Americans. I assume that the people I write for are not Hindus, because if they were Hindus, they would know most of the stuff I write about. So I write a book and I say Vishnu is a god and Shiva is also worshipped, and I think Hindus know that. So I'm writing for people who don't know. So my assumption has always been, and I realize now falsely, especially during the last few years, that I am writing for an audience who knows nothing about Hinduism, and I have to tell them everything. And I also assume that they know some of the things that Americans know, such as who Woody Allen is, or something of that sort. And I think that that was once true and is no longer true. And I would write the book differently if I had primarily thought that Hindus would be reading it as well. I would still have to say Vishnu is a god and Shiva is a god, because I'm mostly writing for non-Hindus who don't know who Vishnu and Shiva. But I think I'd be more aware that I'm going to have a Hindu audience than I have been for most of my academic life. So that's certainly something. So I would have it edited better, and I would write with a greater awareness of a Hindu audience, but I wouldn't do anything else differently. That is to say, I wouldn't say, I wonder whether the fact that Vivekananda. So I said, in writing about meat eating and the history of people who ate beef in India, which they did right through history, and I mentioned in particular that Swami Vivekananda said, and is on record as having said, that I eat beef and I recommend other people to eat it too. This is one of the things that Batra objected to. Well, it's true, and it's an important fact, especially because so many people on Wikipedia and elsewhere say Vivekananda never said that he ate beef. So I would stick to that, and the fact that people like Batra will object to it would not prevent me from putting it in the book. On the contrary, the fact that so many people say Vivekananda never ate beef would make me more committed to putting it into my book, so that somewhere it should be on record with a footnote about where he said it and who said he said it, and several different sources which affirm it, that it is a fact. Now, the trouble with PL 295A is it doesn't matter whether something is true or not. If it's hurtful, you can't say it. So that's the tricky part. So you don't have to say everything you know just because it's true. If someone is ugly, you don't say, I think you're very ugly. There are truths that need not be stated, but that's an important truth to state, because it's part of a blanket erasing of an aspect of Hinduism which ate meat and did other things as well, which I wish to put back in the picture precisely because Batra and the RSS people are erasing it. So even knowing, especially knowing that it would make Batra mad, I would put in the book the fact that Vivekananda ate meat. So that I wouldn't change.
Thank you.
Thank you for your responses, Professor. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I do think that in many places that you've written about this controversy, you did contrast the pious way with the academic way and identify the study of religion in India with the pious way. And I think when you don't unpack what it means, it conveys the impression. So for example, in India, we may not have the discipline of religious studies, or it may be new, but India has chosen to study religion under the rubric of philosophy. And there's a historical reason for that, and there's a very sophisticated study of religion and the production of so many fine works, critical works, under the rubric of philosophy that has taken place in India. So I think one has to carefully articulate the dichotomy when it is made. But I appreciate it. And secondly, I do not think, I'm reiterating this point, that anyone is arguing that non-Hindus should not study Hinduism or do scholarship about it. I think that there are lots of fair questions about how the methodology of study, especially, as I said, the issue of normative judgments, even when you are using a methodology that you consider to be descriptive. I want to make one last comment about, I'm no fan of Dinanath Batra for many reasons, but I think that his concern or his approach to the study of the tradition is not as bizarre or as unfamiliar as sometimes is represented to be. So, I mean, you have described him, for example, as a fanatical, semi-literate old man. And that may not help us to critically engage his religious worldview, because he has a religious worldview that may be recognized in many traditions as well. Basically, what was problematic was his recourse to law to enforce a theological position. And I mean, clearly, none of us will agree with that. A theological position should be debated in the theological sphere. And this is what is problematic with him. And clearly, he has a theological position, but he wants to homogenize the tradition and not also admit a diversity of voices within the tradition. But he's also coming from a certain kind of theological position that is well recognized in Hinduism and in other traditions, which is arguing for the authority of the Vedas as the foundational text from which one can speak normatively about the Vedas. There's nothing crazy about that, about that argument. That argument is very similar to what people in the traditions of Judaism or Christianity or other traditions or Islam make. And you know, he's in the tradition of the Arya Samaj, he's in the tradition of the classical Purva Mimamsa understanding of Vedic authority and so on. So he's arguing for a legitimate position. The use of law is wrong to legitimize theological position. But I think we will engage him, perhaps, let us not represent it as something that is uniquely bizarre about the Hindu tradition or about this voice. I think it helps the debate when we recognize that this is a way of speaking about religion that is recognizable across religious traditions, and engage it in that particular kind of place and space.
I would just like to have the chair's prerogative and add to that one of the things that I found disturbing about the debate that raged was that it was so much about your point of view and his in India that so many other voices were drowned out, or they were sort of categorized in one camp or the other, which meant that certain comments that really were worth investigation to be a part of the discourse were really silenced, and that is part of the self-censorship, I think, that goes on. And when we talk about things, for example, I'm from California, and I can tell you that the California textbooks are really embarrassingly out of date. So when we conflate what's going on in India to the conversations about what ought to be happening with our K through 12 textbooks, we miss out on having you look at the textbook and go, I think you would be shocked at some of the things that are said. You could help. You know, you could help. So I wanted to just add that to the conversation as well.
There's a lot of different balls in the air at this point. As for the textbooks, I do know that they're terrible, and I actually have been working with a young man who's part of the Hindu American Foundation I am going to help with the vetting of the textbooks. It was just that the way that it was done was unacceptable, which is to just redate everything. It was a mixture. I guess it was a mix of genuine concerns, like it's all about caste all the time, which is wrong, with the desire that should be solved by removing all references to caste which is wrong. So you're veering back and forth, ricocheting back and forth, the two extreme positions, and I agree that that's wrong. I want to say a little bit more about Batra and whether he's unique or crazy. I don't think he's unique, and I also don't think he's crazy. His views on the authority of the Veda are reasonable and part of an Indian tradition. His views on science and his introduction of totally, I would say, bonkers is the technical word I think I want, totally bonkers science into the textbook is crazy. So there's a lot of different things. Batra is a complicated person, as we all are. So I didn't think that his defense of his own tradition against blasphemy was necessarily crazy, or indeed his reverence for the Veda, which is quite traditional. But there are aspects. He went much, much too far in the sorts of things that he objected to. And I think, for instance, he was simply incorrect about the Vivekananda issue, that certain facts of history should be resorted to as facts. The idea of religion as philosophy is interesting, and of course there have been studies of religion done in India at all time. We spoke this morning also of a religious dialogue tradition in India, which goes back to Ashoka and Janaka and Akbar and so forth. So there have been a lot of Sanskrit texts about Shankara and other people who talk to the Buddhists, who talk to the Charvaka. So there are examples in history of confrontations between different religions, and there are also examples of religious studies. But I think it's significant, Anant, that you spoke of religion as philosophy, because I think that's true. And I think it's part of the problem, because the whole Sanatana Dharma argument is that Hinduism is mostly just philosophy. And once you've studied philosophy, you've studied Hinduism. And that was the European view, too. Schelling and Hegel and Schlegel and all those guys, the American transcendentalists, they all thought that Hinduism was great. It was just philosophy. And what got left out was all the rest of Hinduism. And that's really what the fight is about. The things that Batra and others object to in the book are the parts which are not philosophy. And that's the part that I also want to see in Indian discussions of their own religion in India.
So I wanted to leave the last 15 minutes for conversation, but I want to just thank you all for so far this terrific conversation. Let's have people come to the microphones. And we'll get through as many questions. I think we'll take a couple of questions at a time. And if you wanted to direct them to anyone in particular, let us know. And if you would say your name and what institution you're with, that would be great. And we'll start over here.
I'm Linda Hess from Stanford. I want to thank all three people. This is really tough stuff to do on a public platform, and I think you've done it with grace and intelligence, so thank you. I wanted to introduce a note of, say, social history of the study of Hinduism in North America, which is, well, all three of you, could I call you venerable, senior? Old. You're people who've had a long and fruitful career, all three of you, and I'm just thinking about the younger generations. Part of our problem has been that, Indian diaspora, let's say in the United States, has, in its early periods, it did not produce many children who were encouraged to go into the humanities. So we just didn't have Hindu scholars. In the middle and younger generations of scholars now, we have so many Hindu scholars of Indian origin, or we also have like white Hindus. Everybody knows about this conversation. So I would just like to say that the voices of middle and younger generation scholars who are in the room and around the conference would be really relevant to this conversation, and maybe somebody might speak up.
Thank you. Now we'll come over to this side, and we'll keep it brief so we get to everyone.
Okay, Jeffrey Long from Elizabethtown College, and again, I would like to express my gratitude to all three speakers. I know all of you and have deep respect for all of you. I'm my comments are especially directed to Anant, but really to everyone. At first, I'm of course very sympathetic to your position of often getting it from both sides. I got Twittered for saying that Wendy loves Hinduism. How do you dedicate your whole life to the study of something if you hate it? Obviously not true. The point, though, I wanted to make was that draw attention to at the opening of the panel, there was the statement from the mission statement of the AAR talking about how the AAR welcomes a variety of perspectives, including both from inside and outside traditions. And there is, of course, very good work being done in Hindu theology. Anant, you are doing a good deal of it, and many others are as well. And yet, we find that despite repeated attempts, there's still very firm refusal on the part of the AAR to allow the existence of a Hindu theology unit, even though there are dozens of Christian theology units, and similar, few analogous units for other religious traditions. So it's not only in India that censorship seems to happen, and there are certainly, Anant, as you were saying, different normative frameworks, and maybe those need to be brought out and engaged with each other in a more explicit way in the academy. So.
Thank you very much.
Carla Bellamy from the City University of New York. I'd like to also thank the panelists for their careful thought and caring. This is really more a point of information, I guess, than a question. Talking about sort of the impact that this has had on research, you mentioned visas, and that is true in the UK. But also for people like myself who work ethnographically in India, because there's awareness of this debate, around Professor Doniger's book particularly, there has been, in my experience, more defensiveness and an increased challenge in sort of doing the sort of deep and careful working with communities that I felt was easier maybe 6 or 7 years ago than it is now. And I think that's important to articulate. And I don't know what the solution is because of the Wikipedia problem and the media problem. And no matter how careful we are here, it's just out there swirling around. But it's worth mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Nicholas O'Connell from the Hindu American Foundation and Columbia University. My question is, Professor Doniger, you were introduced as one of the most powerful voices in Hinduism studies. Do you think that being a powerful voice bestows upon you an additional responsibility for caution that you might not have if you were a little-known or insignificant scholar or a random voice on the internet? And as a second question, what is the most effective way for people who have factual problems with your work to communicate with them to you in a way that you'll respond? Because I know in the past some people have written things online addressed to you and they have not felt like their problems have been sufficiently responded to. Thank you.
Well, there's power and there's power. I think that any scholar has a responsibility to try to make sure that what she says is accurate and true. And I have no greater responsibility than anybody else. I've always felt that I had a responsibility to do so, and I've always tried to do so. This issue of whether you can say something true that's hurtful is what's becoming more complicated. The Vivekananda case, for instance. And again, I think that precisely because I'm not only powerful and old, as Linda has pointed out, but also that I have tenure, and that I don't have as much to lose as someone who doesn't have power, it makes it more important for me to say what I really think is true, even though I think it may have consequences. In other words, I feel that younger scholars are vulnerable in ways that I am not, and therefore I would not advise some of my students to undertake certain projects in India for their PhD dissertations. That might have been okay. I take the point that the young anthropologist said about people being nervous and having to justify themselves more in India now because of all the ruckus and so forth. So I think it makes me it makes a greater responsibility for me to to say what I really think, even though it might offend some people, if I think that it is a valid and important point to make, precisely because I'm old and out of reach in some ways. As for correcting things, I have always tried to correct errors in my books, but I don't engage in internet conversations. I just don't feel that the internet is the place where I carry on my scholarship. I respond to reviews in academic journals, and I respond to emails sent to me saying, I think you're wrong about this. I've had a lot of emails, and I've responded to all of them. People have responded about, I just simply don't read blogs. I don't do Facebook. I just don't feel that the internet is where I wish to carry on scholarly arguments. So I don't even know what's out there. I really don't follow it at all anymore. I respond to academic scholarly criticism, and I do respond to emails also where people say, you know, on page 12 you say that, and so forth, and I think you're wrong. And I have a list of errata. We made changes from the New York edition to the Delhi edition. We caught a number of mistakes and we corrected them, and if there is, as I gather, going to be another Indian edition, I'll correct other mistakes if I can as well. So I am amenable to that, but not through the internet, not through blogs.
Hi, my name is Carrie Doe. I'm currently at the Phillips University in Marburg. Thank you all for this very interesting discussion. This was very, very interesting. I have a question, though, for the gentleman on the panel, which is that you said, if I understood correctly, that Professor Doniger needs to state her normative claims more clearly, that even though she's not a Hindu, she still has normative claims as a scholar. So my question is, if she had done that, if she had done that more clearly, would the publication, would her book then therefore be acceptable to you and to the people who wanted to censor her work? And if not to the latter, would you be willing then to advocate against the censorship of her book? To what degree does she need to state her normative claims?
That's directed for you, Anant.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think part you've understood my argument and part you probably didn't, in some ways not represented it, or at least what I was trying to say correctly. I spoke about the normative claims in a larger point I was making about the religious studies method, because I think, and I would, in all respect, say this about Professor Doniger, that she locates herself in the method of religious studies, which she characterizes as largely talking about religion or descriptive method. My main point in this contribution here is that there is normative work going on in the religious studies method implicitly, and people are not very clear about identifying where the norms are coming from. But I think it's happening, and I want to. This is a larger question I'm raising for the academy and the method of studying religion. Now, I am not in favor of any kind of censorship. I've made that very, very clear in my opening statement, and I will defend Wendy's right to pursue truth and to do scholarship as she sees it, because I want that for myself as well. And I think that the tradition to which I belong has a right to interrogate her scholarship, but not deny her the freedom to engage in that scholarship. But I think that there are important questions to raise about methodologies of studying the Hindu tradition, and to raise about the limits of the religious studies methods, in which, and this is also relates to Jeff's fine point, which is, there is a power issue. There's a power issue in the academy which is not open to Hindu theology and the discourse of Hindu theology, and open largely to the social scientific method of studying religion, which leads to certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of conclusions. But I think that there should be openness to methodological diversity, including the study of theology. I think that, identifying her norms, there are people who will not be satisfied. Nothing will satisfy them about certain kinds of scholarship, but that's not the That's not the issue. I think as a scholar, it's very important to be more self-aware and self-critical about the normative locations that you're coming from when you are interrogating a tradition. This is why I think, I know I'm going on long, but I think Hindus, thoughtful Hindus, recognize the normative dimension in your work. And that's what makes it significant for them. And they want to engage that, but you also have to say, well, this is... So when you talk about caste, for example, I am also interrogating caste, and I have a book called A Hindu Theology of Liberation, in which I have a chapter on caste, and I identify where my normative location is. Where do I stand in raising these critical questions about caste? When you interrogate caste, where is your normative position? I think it's a fair question. I think it's an important question. Yeah.
I'm going to turn it to you, but you go ahead. I just wanted to add one thing to it, which is right in line with this, with the question of the responsibility of the, very lauded academic, and I am 100% in the camp of we are the ones with the full professorship and so forth that should be saying all the controversial things that others can't say. But I also think that there's an obligation to listen really well, too. And I think that's part of what you were bringing up.
2 quick points as beginning to the end. First of all, I certainly think that Hindu theology is a real subject and should be part of the AAR program. We're doing Hindu theology at the University of Chicago in the theology department. We have Hindu students applying for it next year. I'm actually a young Swami Narayanan man who's doing it. So I think that's a real mistake that the AAR, there's no question about that. I'm with you, Jeff. It's a real subject which should be taken. As for norms, I thought I was absolutely laying them out on the line in the beginning of the Hindus when I called it an alternative history, and I said what it was alternative to. I said that I believe in finding the voices of women in Indian texts. I believe in finding the voices of Dalits and people of low caste in Indian texts. That's my normative view. I believe that the sexuality of Indian texts is a good thing and is not incompatible with religion and piety. So that's my that's a normative stance, right? That I really believe that it's important and good that women and people of low caste should speak, and that they do speak in the text, and that I am biased in that I'm ferreting out as much as I can from texts that talk about all sorts of things. I'm choosing the texts about women. I'm choosing the texts about Dalits. I'm choosing some of the texts about the celebration of sexuality because I think that women and Dalits and sex are all good things. B, I think Hindus have thought that many Hindus throughout history have thought that women and Dalits and sex are good things, and that voice has been smothered by the dominant view. So those are norms, right? I even say that I'm a non-observant Jew myself. That's where I come from. I don't see how much more naked I could be in expressing what my biases are than I was in the introductory pages of the Hindus. So here stay ich, kann nicht anders.
Sounds like we have the makings of another panel for next year. We do have time for one more question, and our patient last questioner, please say your name and where you come from.
I'm Momita. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oslo, and I wanted to talk about the insider-outsider problem that we have spoken about today. I do ethnography among the Kumbhakar caste in Bengal, which is where I come from. And I started my work at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences with the Subaltern Studies group. And I had I would have liked to call myself an atheist then. But when I continued my work to Europe, I suddenly realized that I'm a Hindu, because it's in anthropology, because there is a certain problematic of familiarity and strangeness, which is sort of at the heart of it. If we don't call it piety, at least if we call it embeddedness in a culture, you're often considered too close to know what's going on. So then there is the idea of the native anthropologist, whose account may or may not be objective enough. So I just wanted to also talk about the other side of this, that sometimes being a Hindu, or I don't know, I would like to call myself a non-practicing Hindu after thinking about all this, but even then, as an insider as well, there is an insider's account, which is sometimes not considered objective enough. So I wanted to speak then from anthropology as well. So.
Thank you. That's why we need each other.
It sounds like we have the makings of some further conversations to continue on, and I just want to thank everyone. I think I didn't say who I am at the beginning of this, so I'm Barbara McGraw, the director of the Center for Engaged Religious Pluralism, St. Mary's College of California, and I have had the privilege of moderating this absolutely fantastic panel. Did everything I hoped it would, and I really am grateful for all of you here today and for the wonderful comments and questions from the audience. Thank you so much.